A Penguin a Day, Penguin Moderns number 7, George Orwell's Notes on Nationalism. Hi, welcome to Garage Geek. So this is volume 7 of the Penguin Moderns. George Orwell. I don't think I need to give much background on George Orwell, writer of 1984, Animal Farm, which I've also read A Trip to Wigan Pier, which is nonfiction. So I am familiar with his nonfiction writing, but when I saw that I had to read this, I thought it was going to be pretty boring. Notes on Nationalism. I was really wrong. Let's go ahead and look at the back. Biting and timeless reflections on patriotism, prejudice, and power from the man who wrote about his nation better than anyone. Now, the frontispiece states, nationalism is inseparable from the desire for power. So when we open this up, it states George Orwell was born in 1903 in Bihar, India, and he died in 1950 in London, England. So there are so many books available in Penguin Modern Classics. I will put a couple of them on the screen, but if you want, you can go ahead and pause that to look at all the titles that are available. So in this volume, we have 3 different essays. They're all nonfiction because they're essays. The first one is Notes on Nationalism. Second, Anti-Semitism in Britain. And third, The Sporting Spirit. Right off the bat, I thought, politics, sports. And politics, government, and sports. All 3 topics that I am not that interested in. But these essays were excellent. He won me over, even with the sports one. Each one, of course, since they're essays and they're argumentative essays, they set forth an argument and then he goes about giving his proof. So it's really an injustice for me to, do an overview and not get into the nuance of the argument. But I am going to be explaining a little and showing some quotes. One of his first arguments is, nationalism is not to be confused with patriotism. Patriotism is of its nature defensive. Nationalism, on the other hand, is inseparable for the desire for power. The abiding purpose of every nationalist is to secure more power and more prestige, not for himself, but for the nation or other unit in which he has chosen to sink his own individuality. He goes on to say that it does not necessarily mean loyalty to a government or a country, still less to one's own country, and it is not even strictly necessary that the units in which it deals should actually exist. He does say that it's very difficult, in fact, impossible to define these terms, although there are definitions for them, but they mean different things to everybody, and that's part of the problem. So I'm skipping ahead in the essay. The essay is quite long. It is 32 pages, so over half of this volume. He does use a word in here, which I found really intriguing. He uses the opposite of pacifist to be bellicist, and I thought, what a cool word. Now, when it comes to nationalists, he says he has an argument where people denounce when the opposition does something, but when their own party does it, it's fanatically overlooked or even endorsed. The Eltons and Pritts and Coughlin's, each of them simply an enormous mouth bellowing the same lie over and over again, are obviously extreme cases, but we deceive ourselves if we do not realize that we can all resemble them in unguarded moments. One prod to the nerve of nationalism and the intellectual decencies can vanish, the past can be altered, and the plainest facts can be denied. Now, like I said, I didn't do a great job going over that essay. It's nuanced. There's a lot of points to be made, but it was really well worth it, and I'm really glad that I read it. The second essay is called Anti-Semitism in Britain. And remember, these are written around World War II. Let's see, they were written in 1945. So this one is Anti-Semitism in Britain. And again, this is a nuanced argument that has many points, and I'm just giving you a few. He says that there is no real Jewish problem in England, yet it is generally admitted that anti-Semitism is on the increase, that it has been greatly exacerbated by the war, and that humane and enlightened people are not immune to it. In this article, he goes to great lengths to talk about how anti-Semitism exists, but people go to great lengths to hide it. Above a certain intellectual level, people are ashamed of being anti-Semitic and are careful to draw a distinction between anti-Semitism and disliking Jews. The other is that anti-Semitism is an irrational thing. So he was stating how it's okay to make derogatory comments toward Jews, but it was very important not to seem anti-Semitic. It's a very subtle argument, but it's important. Yet one of the marks of anti-Semitism is an ability to believe stories that could not possibly be true. One could see a good example of this in the strange accident that occurred in London in 1942 when a crowd, frightened by a bomb burst nearby, fled into the mouth of an underground station, with the result that something over 100 people were crushed to death. The very same day, it was repeated all over London that the Jews were responsible. Clearly, if people will believe this kind of thing, one will not get much further by arguing with them. The only useful approach is to discover why they can swallow absurdities on one particular subject while remaining sane on others. He concludes this article by trying to get people to examine their own prejudices. I defy any modern intellectual to look closely and honestly into his own mind without coming upon nationalistic loyalties and hatreds of one kind or another. It is the fact that he can feel the emotional tug of such things and yet see them dispassionately for what they are that gives him his status as an intellectual. The third article in this volume is called The Sporting Spirit. And this one is only about 8 pages long, but I found it particularly powerful. So I thought this was going to be about sports, but it's kind of the opposite. It talks about the overwhelming power of competitive sports for the negative. That sport is an unfailing cause of ill will, and that if such a visit as this had any effect at all on Anglo-Soviet relations, it could only be to make them slightly worse than before. He started the article by talking about how a Russian sports team, football team, visited England to ease tensions among the country, but it just seemed to make it worse. I am always amazed when I hear people saying that sports creates goodwill between the nations, and that if only the common peoples of the world could meet one another at football or cricket, they would have no inclination to meet on the battlefield. Even if one didn't know from concrete examples, the 1936 Olympic Games, for instance, that international sporting contests lead to orgies of hatred, one could deduce it from general principle. Nearly all the sports practiced nowadays are competitive. You play to win, and the game has little meaning unless you do your utmost to win. At the international level, sport is frankly mimic warfare. But the significant thing is not the behavior of the players, but the attitude of the spectators. And behind the spectators, of the nations who work themselves into furies over these absurd contests and seriously believe, at any rate for short periods, that running, jumping, and kicking a ball are tests of national virtue. He goes on to say that worst of all is boxing. One of the most horrible sights in the world is a fight between white and colored boxers before a mixed audience. But a boxing audience is always disgusting, and the behavior of the women in particular is such that the army, I believe, does not allow them to attend its contest. Wow. So then he talks about how audience members just forget all decorum and what is important that the team wins no matter what. As soon as strong feelings of rivalry are aroused, the notion of playing the game according to the rules always vanishes. People want to see one side on top and the other side humiliated, and they forget that victory gained through cheating or through the intervention of the crowd is meaningless. Even when the spectators don't intervene physically, they try to influence the game by cheering their own side and rattling opposing players with boos and insults. Serious sport has nothing to do with fair play. It is bound up with hatred, jealousy, boastfulness, disregard of all rules, and sadistic pleasure in witnessing violence. In other words, it is war minus the shooting. And he goes on to say that it is the most violent combative sports, football and boxing, that have spread the widest. So I was going into this volume thinking that I wouldn't like it too much, and again, I was very surprised at something written 70, 80 years ago can be so important today. Many of the ideas that he is grappling with in these essays are still very, very prevalent and necessary to think about in today's society. The next volume in this series is going to be Gertrude Stein's Food. As always, I want to thank you for the support, and any comments that you have are greatly appreciated.